Kaleid'her'scope, a weekly talk show for women, by women, about women, between women. From the voice that is desperate to be heard to the heroine story that inspires. Every Tuesday from 4 to 5 p.m. on MYCYradio with Magda Zenon. Hello and welcome to another edition of Kaleid'her'scope. This is Magda Zenon here, recording from the buffer zone in Nicosia on a autumny day, because we always worry, we're very concerned about the weather. We were hoping for winter to come, together with the usual suspect, Terry Kafaro. And our guest today is Nora Nadjarian.
Hello.
Who is a writer and a poet, an award-winning writer and poet. And she's just launched her latest latest book of short stories called Selfie. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation.
Nora, tell us a little bit about who Nora is. You actually welcome back to Kaleid'her'scope.
That's
right. Because you've been
yeah.
on before.
I'm not sure that I told you who I was last time that we spoke, and I'm not sure that I'm able to tell you exactly who Nora is. Nora is a multifaceted woman.
Personalities.
That's right. Yes,
they change according to the mood, the situation.
I think the thing that would probably describe me best is sensitive soul. I do have a sensitive soul, and that comes out in all of my writing, whether it's poetry or short stories or whatever, narratives, short plays, because I've also written short plays. So, yeah, I think that kind of shows who I prefer that people find out who I am through my writing, even though I say my work is not autobiographical, because it isn't all autobiographical, and yet the sentiments that come out of my writing, I think, give somebody a pretty good idea of who I am.
If I gave you one word to describe yourself, what would that be? What identity? Because I have one identity.
Oh my gosh, you are. These are really hard questions. I don't know if I could do this in one word. Okay,
identity in one word.
I'll tell you why. I'll explain myself. I don't like the ethnic identity that is forced on us in Cyprus. You're Greek Cypriot or you're Turkish Cypriot. I've never liked the ethnic identity. I've always felt my ethnicity is a travel document. It gives me a passport to move around. It doesn't define who I am.
Okay.
So there are two identities I might go with: an activist and a human being.
Okay.
The rest are things that change. The rest are not standard. Okay, so I'm a woman, but it's not... gender also doesn't really define me, because I hate the boxes that go with identity.
I think my identity is probably creativity. My creativity is my identity. It's what I rely on to express myself. So, yeah, I think creativity.
So, Terry, tell me, what identity would you go with?
Oh, my God. Well, in keeping with Nora's way of approaching that question, I think my intuition, my sensitivity, I related very much when you said that about how you defined yourself. And made me want to ask one question, because I've also defined myself as a sensitive soul. Was your sensitivity supported or understood when you were younger?
Yes, it was. And yet, in many ways, I was left to my own devices.
The best place to be left.
Yes, and I think that's what brought out all these stories. I mean, that's what made me a writer, because I was like on my own in my little world, and I had to kind of play around. And I also feel that I have a very high level of empathy. Like, when people are talking to me, I can
step into their shoes.
I can step into their shoes. I can feel a lot more than I can sense, a lot more than what they're telling me. And I think that comes out a lot in this particular book.
It's actually not a really good quality, but I'll tell you why. Because I'm also quite empathetic. So if someone walks in and they're in bad mood, the bad mood hits me. I can't disconnect from the energies around me.
Okay, I meant it in a more positive way.
No,
I know what you mean, but
I do pick up the good things, but a lot of the time, if someone is feeling bad, I will feel bad with them.
Yeah, this is true. Yeah,
So
this is what I meant.
that's
I
why-
mean, I'll give you an example. I've given this example for like 3 or 4 times.
You see, I'm on a roll today.
During the last week. I was traveling once. This is just one example out of many. And there was a woman sitting next to me, and she couldn't speak very good English. She was Belgian or Dutch. And you know how it is, you strike up a conversation on the plane with a foreign person you've never met before, you're never going to meet again. And this woman kind of opened up to me. She was telling me the story of her life, about her husband who was violent. And, well, this is what I picked up anyway. She didn't use these
That's
words.
it.
What she actually said to me at one point was, I always wanted to fly from him. I always wanted to fly from him. So that kind of made me think, my God, this woman, she's trapped. She feels trapped. And, you know, she wants to get away. She wants a means of escape. And that was the only way she could tell me, you know, that...
But you understood what
I
she was
understood
telling
what
you.
she was telling me, like the story behind the story behind the words. So I tend to do that. Sometimes, as you say, may not be a good thing, because I tend to go off on a tangent. I may be making up stories about people that are not even true. But
I think
it helps with the creative process.
Your
you know,
understanding of metaphor alone, given that you use it so often as a poet, when someone says, the phrase that woman said, of course you would understand it. You know, you would start thinking, what could she be telling me? Do you ever wonder why people are telling you things? Like,
I think they often recognize the empathetic soul.
I think they can see that I'm a good listener. I'm not going to provoke them in any way. I'm just sitting there kind of nodding my head and, oh, well, that's terrible. Or, you know, I put in a few words of comfort or whatever. I'm not to say that I'm Mother Teresa. I'm not. I have a terrible temper. I mean, I can be really bad-tempered. But when people tell me these stories, it's like as if, oh, that's really... I mean, that shouldn't be happening. I mean, it makes me feel bad for them. So, yeah.
When you were just saying that people tell you stories, and then you were saying that a lot of stories are not necessarily about you, but have something to do with your feelings. The title of your book is Selfie. Now, that would make me think that these are stories about you.
Only about you.
No, well, I can see what you mean, but again, this was not my intention. My intention was for people to look at that word selfie and to kind of single out the word self in selfie, and to see that when people are taking photos of themselves, they may actually also be looking into themselves. I think that was the idea behind that title. And also because there's a story in here called Selfie, of a writer who keeps taking selfies of herself. And a lot of them are just totally...
Random.
Yeah. And so, yes, I think that, I mean, the word self is what is the important word here, not selfie itself.
How do you choose the title of a book? And in choosing a title, does the title come first, or do the collection of stories you want to put together come first?
Okay, I'll tell you. The publisher has a lot to do with how the stories come together, and also the title. In the beginning, I thought of exhibition as the title of this collection.
Well, that's similar when you think of it.
Yeah.
It's putting you out
Yeah,
there.
well, yeah, that's what that was my thought. But then I think the publisher, or Jonathan Taylor, who is the editor of this series, said to me, that's a bit of a boring title. I would go for something else. And then we came up with Selfie, and I think I'm happy with Selfie
I
as
think
a title.
Kim Kardashian has got a book called Selfie or Selfie.
Is she really?
Because she takes a lot of selfies.
Yeah.
So that came from...
I have another question about how much input did you have in the cover, the choice of the cover art, which is, I'll describe for the listeners, we're just looking at not a face, just a head of hair, where the hair, and I think it's female hair, because the hair is tied up in a knot. And
the decision for the cover was mine, the final decision, because I got all kinds of ideas from the publisher himself, which I did not like. They were pictures of women actually taking selfies, or looking out into the distance, or looking into a mirror and things like that. I really didn't like them. I rejected all of them, and then we talked about it, and then we came up with this one, which I think it fits perfectly with what I had in mind.
Right, which is kind of the opposite, like you were saying. It has little to do with that social media identity of selfies, which are kind of casual and very flattering usually, but your work is very internal and very not casual, and oftentimes the subject of the story, it's not flattering in that it's not easy, it's not pretty, it's not,
Exactly.
So if I look, so in a way it's the perfect picture, because it's precisely, it tells more about, the actual title is Selfie and Other Stories, like other stories we tell ourselves or other stories we tell, and the fact that we don't see a face brings us more quickly out of that idea of selfie,
But tell me, how did this book come about? How did you choose? Are the stories that are in here all written one after the other, or do you start developing a theme in the kind of stories you're writing, which is very different? I mean, a book is easy to see why it's there because it's one idea, or one thread.
Right.
But these are disconnected.
A lot
or
of
not.
these,
In a way,
well,
yes, but I see connections. The more
there
you
are
read
a
it.
lot of connections between the stories. Some intentionally, some totally unintentionally, because a lot of these stories have been published elsewhere, like in literary journals and magazines and anthologies around the world. And one of them was included in Europe. Best European Fiction 2011, which is published in the United States. But the selection that I made kind of led to them being interlinked and interconnected, basically because they all have to do with stories which are not that pretty, as you said. There's a lot of there are a lot of stories in here of women who are trying to make some sense of their lives, trying to, basically on journeys of self-discovery, I would say. Not all women, but mostly about women, mostly women protagonists. Yes, does that answer your question?
Yes. The other thing, so the idea actually comes first. So when you decide to put together a collection, you might have a few of the stories, but then you start writing stories that start connecting in your brain.
That's right, because I think a short story collection should have a theme, a kind of common theme running through. Otherwise, they're just totally disconnected. And somebody actually said during the launch, one of the speakers said during the launch, it's not even, he didn't think that it was a book of short stories. He could see that it was like a whole. It was a little bit like a novella, let's say, because of all these interconnected stories. They could be taken as chapters of a book. Do you see what I mean?
Yes,
So they're not like...
They're disconnected. There is a thread running
There is
through.
a thread running through.
And why short stories and not long stories? What's the difference? I mean, out there you've got... I prefer short stories because I have an attention deficiency. So I find it easier to connect.
I started out as a poet. I was a poet before I became a short story writer. And a lot of people say that actually my short stories are very poetic in any case. So they're like a little bit cross between poetry and short story. They're not short. These are not short stories in the traditional sense.
They are hyper short. I mean, your stories are sometimes just one page.
Yes, and often they're called flash fiction. There is such
I like that word because it means it just flashes in the brain.
It is. I mean, a lot of these are flash fiction. Some are longer than others, but some, one or two are just a page long.
I think isn't it an opportunity for Nora to read one of her stories now, so that we can actually get an idea of how short these short stories are?
Okay, yes.
Okay.
Would you like me to read Blue Pear? Blue Pear is about...
You the writer, you make the
Yes.
decision.
It came up a lot during the book launch. I had three different speakers during the book launch, and all three of them made reference to Blue Pear.
Oh,
so I
okay.
think it was
It obviously
maybe
touched a lot of
I think
nerves.
so too. So I'll read the whole thing. It's not very long at all, but it's very...
It's flash fiction.
It's flash fiction, but it's like a punch in the face or in the stomach. Blue Pear. The air smells of damage. The apple has a slight tinge of red on its skin. She has moved it. She has moved it to the edge of the table somewhere. It's going to fall off the edge into the depths of nothingness. Green hides yellow, black. Colors shift. Her kitchen has become a place for dizzy meals. Her head hurts. She's going to fall. They do not really smell, these apples, have no real scent. What she needs is the smell of pine trees. The pear is a bruise. It looks soft and blue. She wants and doesn't want to touch it. The blood gathers under the blue and the body grows tender, swells slowly. A greasy kitchen surface. She surveys it with her eyes, and a bead of sweat forms on her forehead. And there is a knife, an exact, perfect knife. She knits her brows into a single dark line, then halves it with the knife. She is misunderstood, like punched dough. Most of all by her husband, his short, fat fingers, loud mouth. She bites her nails greedily, swallows them. Her food is nails. No need to cook anything from anywhere into anything. Change your life, exchange those bad eggs, sprinkle some flour to cover the smell of damage and sickness. She is hungry. She knits more brows, handmade brows, more than she can count. She's becoming an expert at home cooking of hatred. Cuts the meat into chunks, watches them sizzle, adds spices, throws the dice into the pan. 6 and 2, 1 and 6. Do you really know me? Do you know I married my first man? Take a chance, the marriage arranged, and a couple of nothing throws. She feels a throbbing pain on one side of her face, how the blood gathers under the moon. One giant leap, and he doesn't know she eats her own nails, her own half-moons. I live under his nail, under his thumb, she thinks. If I could escape, if you can help, please do help yourself to the food. He doesn't know anything personal about her face. His face is a large, grainy enlargement when he comes near her and the knife stares at her brows. She stares back at forgetting to eat last night. Again, the knife reminds her. Hot water comes out of the tap and makes a sound like the sound of a siren, while she rinses blood-stained glasses, dishes. I need scales to measure what I'm missing. 1 gram of love and some things I can't buy. The knife stares at her, and she touches the blue pear on the side of her face. Things are happening in this kitchen, and things are going on, and God help me. She punches a very short number into her mobile phone. My husband is dead.
Okay, that is one of your more severe and extreme and violent, and I'm so happy to have heard you read it because it's more powerful when you hear the author read it. Isn't it incredible? I just have to say, like, that has so many moments that remind me of the poet Nora Nadjarian, because that has, it opens with this completely poetic line that could, the air smells of damage. That sets us up in this way. But there are these beautiful other lines, she's misunderstood like punched dough, or, that something calls for 1 gram of love. Like these are ways that poets kind of deal with imagery, and it really propels the story along. But now that is the kind of story that when you say it, these are stories about women by, is this a journey? Is this a story someone told you and you then turned it into a short story? Is this...
What inspired it?
Yeah.
What was the trigger, for want of a better word?
Well, like I said, it all comes back to that empathy thing. I mean, I've got friends who have not been, they've not been through domestic violence, but they've been through perhaps psychological bullying by their husbands. And
That's exactly the same thing. Domestic violence does not mean physical. Gender violence is physical, emotional, economic,
true, yes.
sexual.
That's right.
In fact, psychological violence is actually worse because you cannot see the marks. So you assume they're not there.
Okay, so
that's all.
I see. Yeah. Okay.
I'm just gonna,
anyway, no, I made it into a proper physically.
Yes. I just want to let you know that.
Yes, I understand. Yes,
gender violence is
came out wrong.
Yes, is the whole spectrum of violence. Words can hurt. Worse than
of course
bullets.
they can. Yes. So what I'm trying to say is that I've not heard. These are not reproductions of exact stories that I've heard. Somebody may have just dropped a hint somewhere, and I've picked up that hint and weaved a whole different story around it. I mean, this is my own story. This is not a story that was told, which is why I said,
Yes,
I've not had friends who've been punched like dough or whatever, but they have been punched like dough psychologically. And I've heard some stories like that, like I want to leave him because this, I want to do this because of that. And, you just kind of listen to these stories and these are not even, how can I put it? I would not like for my friends to know that these stories came out of their own stories. So it's like I've changed everything.
Nora, I hate to tell you, but one of us in this room has been a victim of violence. That's how common it is. So don't think that if I tell you a story, it's very arrogant of me to assume that it's my story that you trust.
I see, yeah.
Because it is so prevalent.
True.
So it's personal, but it's personal to all of us.
I also think that story I love because it found a way to reach a very kind of universal, like what Magda is saying, universal kind of imagery. And I was telling Nora in another context that I would use that story to teach 17th century Dutch painting because it opens with an exact description of a 17th century Dutch painting, which is things precariously and morbidly balanced on the edge of something. I mean, the scene that's set is so one of life about to turn into, it to fade. And it's so perfectly kind of, it's a kind of little masterpiece all on its own. But I wanted to ask you something about, you said a lot of these stories are inspired by journeys of self-discovery. Are you a traveler? Are you a journeyer?
Yes, I do travel whenever I can, for pleasure or for meeting friends or basically also to get out of Cyprus.
Oh, you get cabin fever after a while, do you? I think we all have it.
So, yes, I do love traveling.
And I noticed that in one of the, and I don't know if you noticed this when you were writing it or if it's one of the themes, but there's a way that a kind of imagery keeps weaving in and out of a lot of these stories, and it's the image of suitcases that are packed and unpacked. And
where are you going?
Good question.
Where are you going?
Where am I going?
She's the
somewhere,
creative,
hopefully.
She's the creative one. I'm cut to the chase.
Yeah.
Yes, the image of the suitcase. I reread these stories recently, and yes, the image of the suitcase does come up frequently. Maybe it's in my subconscious somewhere. But apart from the fact that I like to travel, I also maybe think of a suitcase as a place where you pack belongings. Like it's like a little container for stuff of your own and that you're gonna take with you somewhere. And perhaps
Do you pack memories as well?
Of course, definitely, yeah.
So it's not just real material things.
Yeah, memories, and also memories that have been passed on to me, perhaps from my grandparents.
And
My
that'll
grandparents
take us to how much does your ethnicity, your ethnic background, inspire what you write?
I think my ethnic background has a lot to do with the kinds of things that I write. Not necessarily, I'm not inspired by my ethnicity, but my ethnicity is something that I carry on my back as a kind of, not a burden, but something that's been passed. It's like in my genes. There's nothing I can do about it. It's a little bit like being Armenian is a bit like being Jewish. It's you carry it in your genes, and there's always in there a sense of loss. I always felt in the stories that my grandparents told me, that sense of loss, that sense of longing for something that you've lost. It's like we're always looking for something that isn't there anymore. It's I distinctly remember my grandmother telling me stories. Oh, when we were in such and such place, and when it kind of triggered up all kinds of images in my mind, and maybe that's why I became maybe that's why my writing is so intense. It's like I'm trying to maybe
Unpack
or find the meaning of all that, the stuff in the suitcase. It's like, oh, you pick something up, oh yeah, my grandma told me this, or this is what my dad said, or yeah, it's a little bit complicated and a bit difficult to explain, but I think you get the idea. It's
And how
it's
much
a journey.
And how much does living in Cyprus inspire you? Or
Oh, very much, because there's also in Cyprus we also have this sense of loss. You talk to people and they're always going back to their childhood, and they're going back to the village, and they're going back to stories that their grandparents told them, their mothers told them, and I think in Cyprus it's still, very prevalent. It's very prevalent, this sense of longing, loss, whichever side of the island you're on.
I've got to tell you one of my stories. My grandparents lived in Nicosia, okay? Mm-hmm. My grandfather was a very educated man, a civil servant, so they lived in the city. Every holidays, my grandma used to send the 4 kids to Carpathia because her sister lived there. So a lot of the memories and the stories my mom used to tell me about her childhood are related to Yalusa.
Mm-hmm.
The playing in the sea and picking shells and in the rocks and in the aunt's house and in the... So last year, one of her cousins took me to Yalusa. And he took me through all the stories.
Right.
And it's almost as if she appeared in front of me, because the stories, the memory...
Yeah.
I used to come back to Cyprus, and we had to go to Yalusa to see Auntie Anne. Had to go. But the strength was not in my memories of having gone there. The strength was in the stories imparted to me from my mum.
Yeah.
And they're strong. I went there, and it wasn't painful. In fact, it was healing going back.
Mm-hmm.
There was a sense of warmth, but it was so strong, this feeling, and it was my mom's memories. It wasn't my memories.
Mm-hmm. I have very similar experiences through my mom, who used to tell me stories about Kyrenia, which I couldn't visit until I was like a few years ago. And always in my mind, I had this image of this beautiful sea, these beautiful beaches of Kyrenia.
Not like Carpathia.
And and then that inspired me a lot. Before I could go to Carpathia to actually see it for myself. I used to write imaginary poems as if I was in Kyrenia, using my imagination. It's a very strange and surreal.
It is surreal.
Concept to explain to somebody who's never been this.
It's very surreal because when my cousin took me, and he's a really wonderful man, but he mumbles. So I thought, okay, how am I going to get through this? As I said, he's a lovely human being, but he talks into his beard.
Uh-huh.
And I thought, I've got a whole day with this. At the end of the day, I felt wonderful because the stories, it might not have even been the stories he was telling me. I might not have heard every word. But he was walking me through, maybe it was just walking there where my mum had walked. But it was so healing.
Mm-hmm.
I came back feeling such a warmth inside of me.
No, that's wonderful. If you can get that feeling out of years of not knowing what you're going to...
and something that was not mine anyway.
Mm-hmm.
Have you used your writing to try to heal that sense of loss that you were understanding, you were hearing in your grandmother's stories or your mother's?
Sometimes, yes. I think mostly in my early poetry, you get that feeling of wanting to heal myself. Like the story I just told you about my mom talking to me about Kyrenia.
Yeah.
She always related it to her youth and, you know, the loss of her youth kind of thing. And, yes, I think in my early poetry that maybe that was...
Did you always find those stories interesting, or did they ever get you upset? Like, that's not my story. Don't keep putting this on me or making me deal with this, or...
No, I always found them kind of magical in a way.
Me too.
Because
I loved
it was
listening to
something that I really wanted to go to those places. And
were there good storytellers in your family besides just the words? Like, was anyone like really kind of riveting for you?
I think my maternal grandmother used to tell nice stories. Very sad, sometimes very sad, and sometimes totally funny. I mean, she would just like kill us we would just look at her and
Okay, here she goes again.
But she was lovely. I mean, she was a lovely human being, and you know, it's just she was something else. Yeah, maybe I mean, it's all these stories that I used to hear, and
What does a story mean for you? Describe what a story is.
A story?
What is a story?
Does it have a beginning, middle, and
I was just going to say, for most people, a story means something with a beginning, a middle, and an end, and in that order. But for me, a story is totally reversed. I mean, the order of that line that I've just told you is totally reversed, can be reversed. You can do a lot of things with stories.
So you rush to the back. It's the end of the story.
You can begin with the ending, and you can end with the beginning, and you can put the middle somewhere else. It's like you are the creator of that. When you're doing things on paper, you are the creator of your story. You can do whatever you want. We were talking about this last week with Teresa about La Nouvelle Vague, the French directors who used to tell their their cinema was based on this concept of not telling the story in the right order as traditional order. And also,
I prefer short stories, even, and when I'm saying short stories, whenever I hear a story, no matter how long it is, there's always a second part. So I'm not hearing the end. I'm hearing the end where there's going to be another beginning. It continues somewhere. There's something that hasn't finished, a personality that still intrigues me to find out where they have gone. So to me, it's not as clear cut as beginning, middle, and end.
Exactly, and a lot of my stories tend to be cut very short, like boom, it ends, and you don't know what happened. I mean, what? It's like a question mark. What happened? Do we really know what happened? And so I leave the do we want to know what happened?
Yes.
So it's a very interesting relationship as well between the writer and the reader, because the reader can tell his own story after your last line, after you've put the last full stop. I mean,
do you think about the reader? When you write the story, do you think about the reader? Or do you think, after you finished it, do you think, I wonder what people think of this? Do you think...
the second, what you just said, the second thing you just said, definitely. I wonder what will people make of this, or will it make any sense, or will people actually know what I'm trying to say? It's a fine line.
But do you want them to actually know what you're saying, or do you want them to interpret, see your words and put it into their own context? Because that's what painters do.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I used to teach my son. I'd take him to an art exhibition and I'd tell him, what are you seeing? And he'd say to me, what's that supposed to be? And I'd say to him, it's not supposed to be anything. What do you see?
Mm-hmm.
Is it the same for you, or do you want me to read something specific?
Now, it's a little bit different with visual art, because visual art is open to all kinds of interpretations.
But
I mean, you can...
Word,
yes, but not so much. A story does have to have meaning.
Mm.
If it doesn't make sense, then it's not a story. It shouldn't be going out into the world in any case. There is definite, I mean, it's a craft. Even though it looks random and it looks...
no, I'm sure it is a craft.
There's you've thought about it, and you've thought about... In fact, somebody told me the other day, why didn't you put the last paragraph first or something like that? And I'd kind of thought about it. It's difficult to explain what the creative process is.
I like that I think this is really interesting. You used the phrase flash fiction to describe the work, and there's a misnomer, because I know there's nothing quick, or it's not written in a flash. And I would argue, and tell me if I'm right or wrong, the fewer words, the tighter the context, sometimes the more difficult, because every word...
The more difficult it is to put together.
Right, because the muscle has to be so tight. Like, you're telling a story, I mean, do you find this format...
This format suits me perfectly, personally, because I find that I can't write long, flowery... descriptive sentences about the clouds, like 5 sentences about what the weather was like today. I just hate that. It's not me. Mm-hmm. This is my style. It's very intense and it's very brief. It's like, it's very, how can I put it? To the point, exactly. Mm-hmm. It's very precise.
But I'm going to ask you again, is there something specific you want? Is it open to interpretation? Do you want me to get something specific, or are you leaving it open?
Many times I'm leaving it open.
Okay.
But what I understand about these stories is my belief. But then what you understand is I am leaving it open in that sense, because the reader is a free human being. You're not going to hold him by the throat and say, look, this is what my story is about, and this is what I want you to believe. Of course, everything is open-ended. Everything is open to interpretation. That's the whole point of art.
Do you like interacting with readers to find out what they did get from your books?
I do, and especially younger readers.
We're all young in this room, don't talk.
No, what I mean is like school kids, for instance. Every year I'm invited to the English school to read them and talk to them about my story, Leadress Street, which is an older collection of short stories. And it's very interesting to get the feedback from these kids who were not even born, who didn't even exist at the time when Leadress Street became a divided, or even before Cyprus became a divided island, divided Leadress Street, a divided street. And a few months ago, I was there, and I asked them, well, why do you think I chose Leitra Street as the main setting or as the scene for this short story? And one girl who was about 13 or 14, she said, because it's a shopping street. And I just had to laugh, because that is what that kid knows, and that's what that kid can relate to. Do you know what I mean? It's like, it's so interesting to get that feedback and to...
I think it's one of the scariest parts of creativity, because you're alone creating, you're working on a concept, and you know it, you think you're communicating it, and then you let it free out into the world.
Exactly, yeah.
And it's like, it must be like, Magda, having a child. As much as you try to control and kind of inspire it in a certain direction, you have no real control. And so it can be interpreted any which way. It could be Leitra Street, could be the shopping street.
Yes.
And you know, the metaphors change, and you just hope that you've fed that work of art with enough layers of you and images of
to kind of at least to show them a path that they can follow, that it's there. But then if somebody decides to walk off, you know,
right.
Like,
I mean,
there's nothing you can do.
So do you like this kind of this time right now that you're in, where, you know, you're not writing, you're actually kind of promoting the book? Is this a comfortable?
It is. It is and it isn't. I mean, it's kind of very exhausting to try and explain to people what you've done with this. I mean, what's the craft? What was the thinking behind it? This and that. But I do love it when people have read the books or a story or stories, and then I can hear exactly what they have to say, what they've got out of it. And it's like, wow, that's for me, that is just such a gift. You know?
Can I say that this collection gave me one of my heartiest laughs that I've had in a long time, and this is a very serious collection of short stories in general, but in the Not Edgar Carrot, there is a moment that I will not even share, but it is hilarious. And do you know the moment I'm speaking of? It's kind of
where she goes to the supermarket.
Yes. And so there are just like these, you know, and also with the mechanic. That's Edgar Carrot, right? Yeah, with the mechanic. And so I think that there's also a way that like you don't know when your audience will laugh with you, or if that was an intended place for them to laugh. Are you ever astonished at people, like, kind of, maybe I just astonished you with that, like, that I found a part of that story really funny?
Well, let me tell you two things. First of all, that story is kind of autobiographical.
Really?
Because Edgar Carrot really did come to Cyprus a few years ago, and yes, I did miss the evening then when he was supposed to give a talk, and I was literally kicking myself. I found out like 2 days after he'd been and gone, and I was literally kicking myself because I really do love Edgar Carrot. Yes, I missed it, and he's a brilliant Israeli short story writer. He writes flash fiction, brilliant stories, very tight and very precise. So I missed it, and then I cried for about half an hour because I was so frustrated and angry with myself. And then I stopped and I thought, something good must come out of this story. I'm going to write a short story about it. So that's how that story came about. And the other thing that you said about, have I ever been surprised by somebody's reaction? That happened with a short play that I wrote earlier this year. It was actually performed in London in May 2017. Wow. Yeah, and that was also a pretty serious play. 2 characters, an English woman and a Greek Cypriot man who had an affair in the 1950s. The English woman was married. So anyway, that's basically the story behind the story. And There was a line which I can't remember exactly now, and but the audience were like, they were a very good audience. I'm not saying, I mean, they were perfect, but there was just one line which I thought was like really serious, and they all laughed, and I was like, oh,
Okay, what happened here?
What happened here? But that's just, you know.
Could it have been nervous laughter? Was
Maybe,
it that kind of line?
maybe. I don't remember exactly.
Yeah, but still, it's just
it kind of made
unexpected.
me think, oh, maybe I should look at that line again. I mean, as I say, it wasn't like they were making fun or anything. It was just, oh, that line wasn't supposed to be funny, but they found it funny.
Do you ever feel you're going to run out of stories?
The terror of the blank page. Of course, it could happen at any time. It does happen. It happens regularly. But then you have to...
How do you start your inspiration?
Inspiration can come from anything. It can come from a snippet of conversation. It can come from a painting that I'm looking at. It can be a kid does something silly in the middle of the street. It depends. I mean, or what somebody tells me, something that I read, something that I remember. It can come from different things, but crafting that idea, I mean, that initial spark is there, but then I write it down in a notebook, let's say, but then it's just one line. The boy said such and such, full stop. And for me, when I look at that line, I know exactly which boy, when, where, you know, I have it in my head. But then, how do you make that into a story? Or how do you craft that into a poem? Or, you know, that's the hard part.
Were you aware you were going to be a writer all along? Like when you were young, were you collecting lines like this, or...?
Yeah, I wrote a song when I was about 7. I know, okay, everybody writes songs and
No, not
poems.
everyone.
I wrote a song and I showed it to my mom, and she looked at it and she said, "Oh, that's nice, dear." And I think it was about Christmas or something. But I used to love reading more than writing. When I was a kid, I used to really get into the story of what I was reading. Again, coming back to my childhood, I remember reading an Armenian fairy tale or a little book for kids, and it was about a little boy who became homeless. He was totally, like, he didn't have any clothes, and it was cold and winter, and he had to leave his family, and he ended up sitting on the branch of a tree playing the panpipes. And I was sitting in a corner literally crying my eyes out because of this story. And my mom discovered, saw me, and she said, "What's the matter?" She thought that something was desperately wrong. And I said, "Look at this story. Look at this. I said, look at this story. Look at this little kid. He's writing, and he's crying, and he's, all by himself." So I used to always feel whatever I was reading. And I think that again, my life as a writer, transported my life as a writer. I always feel what I'm writing about. Whoever is reading it also feels it too.
Do you remember the first book you published? Do you remember what you felt when you saw your first book in the bookshelf being advertised, and someone actually going to buy? Do you remember that feeling?
Yeah, I do. It was a book of It was a little book of poetry. It's called The Voice at the Top of the Stairs. It was my first poetry book, and yeah, it was. I always, whenever I see that little book, it's a little red book which is now out of print, with a picture of a woman at the top of the stairs. But the collection is called The Voice at the Top of the Stairs, not the woman at the top of the stairs. So, yeah, whenever I see that little book, I think, yeah, I became a poet with that book. And whenever I look at this one, I think, I
Literature
became
Street.
a short story writer with this one. This is what made me a writer. Literature Street,
When was the book of poetry published?
2001,
And Literature Street?
2006.
Okay.
So you've been publishing pretty regularly since 2001. I mean, I'm looking at a number of books of poetry and essays. And
Yeah.
when do you find time to write?
I make time, and normally I write at night. I'm a very, like an owl.
Nocturnal
I'm
creature.
very nocturnal. I create at night. And
Why? What's your real job? Or not your real job?
I'm
What pays the
a real job.
No, what pays the rent? That's when I say the
Versus
rent.
your surreal job.
my surreal job.
As a
No,
poet.
I'm a teacher.
Okay.
I have to pay the bills
I know,
somehow.
the same
Yeah.
way I feel.
Mhm.
That's why one has to pay the bills and the other one
That's right.
fills the soul.
Yeah.
I'm a nocturnal person too, and I think it's because certain things get tired and relax, and I just actually feel freer late in the wee hours of the night. I actually have some of my best. I think they're my best ideas.
When I used to work on the magazine, I used to work from home. I used to go to the office one day a week, and it was so nice that I'd put my son to bed at 9 o'clock, and then get the glass of wine, get all the notes, and work till 5 o'clock in the morning. But it was before Facebook, because Facebook can be disruptive.
It can be. You're
But then I
absolutely
could
right.
sit, then it would be the quiet time. You could put your phone on silent and just go through and choose to answer the phone if you felt your...
Yeah, or just put it down. I
Yes.
used to, mhm.
With social media, do you get much involved in what people are saying about your work?
I used to be terrible at this kind of thing.
What about?
About finding out whether I've been reviewed somewhere, or if somebody said something about my book or is written somewhere. I occasionally Google myself and discover all kinds of things that have been published about me. A Wikipedia page, this, that, and the other. My nephew once said
terrifying.
my nephew once said to me, he's 9 years old, he said, "Nora, you're famous." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "I Googled you. There's a Wikipedia page about
Absolutely, yes. I found you on Wikipedia.
Do you have a Wikipedia page?
No, I don't have a Wikipedia. I'm not as famous as Nora.
you." So,
How do parents don't like the idea? A lot of parents think that this is not a real thing to do. Write books and poetry. How did your parents, your family, were they supportive of this, or are they supportive of
oh
this?
yes, they're very supportive. Especially my dad. My dad was a great reader. I mean, still is. I think he's the one who introduced me to the world of books. He was the first person who took me to a bookshop to buy Enid Blyton books when I was
love
about
them.
I was about 10.
The famous
And until
5.
then, yes, Secret 7.
Yeah.
And yes, I chose my first books in a bookshop with my dad, and I kind of owe it to him, I think, as well. My
And-
love for books.
And you're writing in English often. Solely in English? Is that what most of your creative...
Not all the time. I do write some in Armenian, even though Armenian is my mother tongue. I don't feel confident enough to be able to write a whole book in Armenian, in English, from the age of about 10. So then I went to study in the United Kingdom.
But you speak Armenian at home.
Yes, yes. That was...
I think that's awesome that that even kids from a small age, wherever they are, speak Armenian. The home language is Armenian, and it's one thing that doesn't always happen with the Cypriot kids. Because they were an English colony. English always used to sneak in, right, brother, from the side door.
I think the Armenians in Cyprus have always been very good about keeping the language in the home. I think elsewhere, I don't think it's that common. In the States, for example,
In
they would
South
speak
Africa, I
English.
remember them speaking Armenian. Or don't I?
It's possible. I mean, it's possible.
Because
but it's
they've
not
always
that
been...
kind of-
the Armenians always stick together. As you said, they like the Jews.
Yeah,
The community is quite tight.
There's a reason for that. It's because they want to, especially the older generation, always felt kind of as if the language is threatened, or the
No, I
religion
understand
is.
that.
Do you know what I
Yes.
mean? It's my grandparents' generation felt that way.
No,
And
I'm
perhaps
not.
my parents too. But now it's not. I mean, there's a lot of mixed marriages, people who speak Greek at home, or mixed, or it's not that strict anymore.
We've got about 5 minutes. Is there anything you want to tell us? Is there anything you want to read to us before we close the show? Why don't
Because
you
I've been talking about my parents, perhaps I even though this is not totally about, not autobiographical, but it's perhaps how some Armenians feel or felt when they were in another country, in the
Okay.
diaspora. Separation, it's called. The time came when they longed to return, because in the living room, my mother packed and unpacked her hands. We will leave when the rain stops, they said. The rain in this country is so unkind. The time came when they could no longer return. My father sat in his remote corner of silence. My mother leant into lamplight and threaded sighs. We will leave when the rain stops, she said. Hummed intricate tuned, sewed invisible tears.
Beautiful. What book is that from?
This is, the poem itself comes from my second collection of poetry called Cleft in Twain. What I read it out of just now is a bilingual English-German collection, which was produced after I took part in a poetry festival in Berlin a few years ago. And they translated a number of my poems into German, so the book exists as a bilingual English-German collection, which I'm very proud of. I think it's a lovely little book, professionally translated and
It's
produced.
awesome that it's been translated into German, and it's in English and it's now in German.
Yeah.
Okay. I think that's a good note to end. Okay. Thank you very much
Thank
for being with us,
you.
Nora.
Thank
you,
you.
Nora.
Thank you, Terry.
Thank you, Magda.
And to the listeners, until next week, stay safe and stay, what you got to work on your empathy. I think empathy is so useful because you do find out things about people. Anyway, stay safe.
Thank you,
and
Magda.
tune in next week because we've always got something exciting to talk about.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
Kaleid'her'scope, a weekly talk show for women, by women, about women, between women. From the voice that is desperate to be heard to the heroine story that inspires. Every Tuesday from 4 to 5 p.m. on MYCYradio with Magda Zenon.